All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to session 2 of 2, a continuation of our Monday conversation. Great to see everyone. I'm going to just have us jump right in. We have plenty to cover today. JR, we're going to have you lead some opening comments, and I'll do some housekeeping, and we'll do introductions after that.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the second technical discussion for this advisory committee. I want to thank you again for your participation in the rulemaking process. We could not be doing this without your time and inputs. So we had a very productive meeting on Monday where several committee members provided feedback, comments, and input regarding the priority list and the TRVs. We hope to continue these discussions in today's meeting. Today's meeting will be a continuation of that discussion from our last meeting. And again, all of the supplemental materials and slides were provided to you ahead of all of today's meeting to help inform you for today's discussions. I'd again like to remind you that today's meeting will be recorded so that we can post it on the rulemaking website. And again, here today, we have both Angela Hesenius and Ben Duncan from Kearns and West here to facilitate the meeting and the discussions. With that, I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thanks, JR. I'll move through some housekeeping pretty quickly. It'll be a reminder from our previous conversation. So if we go next slide, just as a reminder for everyone, JR just alluded, this is a live webinar. So we are recording this conversation. It'll be posted on the Air Toxics website. For this conversation, only panelists have the ability to speak. So for those of you that are joining the webinar from the public, there's no interaction with the public until the public input section at the end of our agenda. And I'll talk about how to engage if you'd like to provide input to the group. Members of the public who are attending are not listed, can't be seen or heard by RAC members or by other attendees. I will note that we have closed captioning available. If that's helpful for your participation, depending on your screen, you can either click the More button and there's a Show Captions, or it may show up as CC at the bottom of your screen. You click on that and it should have captioning available to help your participation. We are disabling chat and Q&A for the public. For our RAC members, we're not encouraging the use of chat. So if you have technical issues, feel free to chat those into the chat, or if there's some additional information that we'd like to share, as David did last time, that references specific parts of rules or information that's helpful for tracking the conversation, we'll do that. But please do not use chat for substantive contributions. I'll just ask you to bring it into the room. We're going to do introductions in a second, but looks like most folks have already followed the directions to change your name and affiliation, so folks know and can really understand the interest-based perspectives that folks are bringing into the room today. If you go next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think you all did a really good job modeling these guidelines, so I'll just have you sort of absorb them and as we reflect back. Again, we've really been intentional about kind of creating an agenda that moves through topics very specifically. We've also created several spaces for roundtable conversations where we can either come back to topics or bring in issues or concerns or topics that you'd like to name. Again, just maintaining candid, constructive conversations, address the issues, address questions, not people, organizations. So we'll keep it there. You did a great job last time, and I expect the same out of today. So then let's move into introductions. So I'll just I have a list here that's in no particular order, so I'm just going to call folks as I move through. First is Travis.
Hello, Travis Quarles with Bridgewater Group, now part of Trinity Consultants.
All right, and then Charla here. Let's see, Charla.
I think Deb Proctor is
Deb, you're
sitting as an
representing.
alternate. Yeah.
Deborah, let's jump to you.
Deborah Proctor, Managing Principal, Tox Strategies.
Thank you. Jeffrey.
Jeff Titchener with Stoll Reeves.
Thanks, Jeff. Jim.
Good morning, everyone. Jim Spar. I'm with Cascade Steel Rolling Mills.
Thank you, Jim. Cassandra?
Cassandra Jackson with the Port of Portland.
Thank you. Crystal, I see Crystal. Yeah.
Crystal Weston with Oregon Environmental Council.
Thank you. Jonah?
Jonah Sanford with the Northwest Environmental Defense Center.
Thank you. I think we have Cheyenne, right?
Good morning, Cheyenne Holiday with Verde.
Thank you. Molly?
Molly Kyle, Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at Oregon State University.
Thanks, Molly. Mary?
Good morning, Mary Pifito, Neighbors for Clean Air.
Thank you. Nadej?
Good morning, Nadej, Multnomah County Environmental Health.
Nadej, you were a little quiet, so if you can check your mic settings.
Is this a little better?
It's a little better. Yes, thank you. Kathleen?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Kathleen Johnson with Washington County Public Health and the Environmental Health Branch.
Thanks, Kathleen. Patricia?
Good morning, Patricia Kohlberg, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Thank you. Is Ryan, I don't see, is Ryan here? Don't see Ryan. Beth?
Beth Ryder, Trinity Consultants.
Thank you. And John?
Hi, John Bird with Roseburg Forest Products.
Good, thanks, John. Did I miss any of our rulemaking members? Okay, then, Jerry, I know you said hi already, but I'll have our agency folks that will be presenting and speaking today introduce themselves. JR?
Sure. JR Giska, Clean Air Oregon Program Manager.
Okay, thanks. Mike?
Hi, Mike Polson, DEQ toxicologist.
And Dave?
Hi, David Fair, toxicologist with the Oregon Health Authority.
Great, thanks. And any other agency reps that I'll just ask you to introduce yourself as we get to that as you contribute. JR, I'm going to pass it to you to lead us through kind of how we're going to spend our time today, and then we'll move into our first conversation.
Great, thanks, Ben. So today the meeting will open with some dedicated time to following up from our discussions on Monday at meeting number 2. This will be an opportunity for REC members to provide additional information for consideration related to the priority list and TRVs from that discussion. Then we'll move into a discussion on the risk-based concentrations and the underlying exposure adjustments applied to some specific types of pollutants. After that, we will review and discuss the proposed changes to the rule language itself. And finally, we'll have time for a final roundtable to provide RAC members with the opportunity to provide final thoughts and input related to the proposed rules. We will then open the meeting and invite public input for the RAC members to consider. I will say one thing just to consider here while we're working through today's discussions. If we could keep the discussions overflow from last time, happy to have those discussions. We're going to try to keep it in the first sort of follow-up discussion, and then at the end, at the final roundtable. When we move through the specific questions, framing questions today, again, just trying to keep the discussions related to those. And if we move through them quickly, we'll have plenty of time for open discussion. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ben.
Great, thanks, JR. So let's move into the first conversation. So as we promised on Monday, as JR said, we had a robust discussion, but we wanted to create some space before moving into the discussion today to just offer some opportunity for folks and hopefully, you know, to the extent that folks bring in either new or different comments that we heard on Monday, I'll encourage that, or certainly additional reflections, thoughts, or ideas that have emerged as you've had a chance to reflect on that space. So I'm not going to police, you know, whether you want to reiterate some things that you already named, but I really do want to encourage us to bring either new concepts or thoughts, ideas, reflections based on that. So I'll just open it up then to reflections from the TRV conversation on Monday. Yeah, Travis.
Yeah, I know we talked about, diesel exhaust, diesel particulate matter quite a bit. And I think, I don't think we've really come to any sort of, consensus on how it should be treated. But I wanted to point out that this is not a new issue. This was talked about with the ATSAC, and there was even a clarification email that was attached to the review minutes, or excuse me, the meeting minutes, where OHA and John Boudreau, had some back and forth, and he even talked about in there about an example where if diesel particulate matter was presenting a risk of, let's say he said 10 in a million, and PAHs were calculating an additional 1 million, 1 in a million, and metals were calculating an addition 2 in a million, his argument is, well, then you should say the risk is 10 versus the risk is 10 plus 1 plus 2. And he also stated, well, you shouldn't say it's 10 minus 1 minus 2 because the DPM accounts for those. So you don't take those out, but that's what it should be. And so I think that's the same type of clarification we're trying to get is if you have a number that represents the risks presented by those other compounds, then we don't need to double count. And so this is not a new issue, and that's why we're trying to get clarification on it. That was one thing I wanted to talk about. I have something else I want to talk about, but I'll stop in case people want to say anything regarding that.
Well, pause. But before two folks respond, Travis, while I have you off mute, I don't know if you saw Mary's question around. Can you talk about the relationship between Bridgewater and Trinity?
Oh, yeah. Bridgewater Group was acquired or merged with Trinity about a year ago. So Bridgewater Group still exists. But we're within Trinity Consultants.
Thank you. Just wanted to have some transparency around that. Thanks for the question, Mary.
Of course.
And so I don't see any hands raised to your question. Do you want to just keep going, Travis?
Sure. Yeah.
I guess I'll just respond, Travis. It's a great question.
Yeah.
We're absolutely, I think the time to address that is going to be in the implementation, because I think we've got, the way that we think about it is the TRVs are based on that tox information. They're the sort of the defining values. And then we move through for CAO to get, and we'll talk about this today, right? To get to the RVCs is how we use them to regulate. Those really are also sort of set and based on scientific and some exposure assumptions. And then the third piece is, how do we use those in a risk assessment? How do we sum them up is really what you're asking. And that's really an implementation question. And given all of the interest around it, we're definitely planning on having a robust discussion about that in the next meeting on implementation. So it's a great question, and we look forward to that conversation. Just in a good flag. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. So the other question or comment is regarding PAHs. And there's several references in the support materials to the Minnesota Department of Health PAH guidance on the relative toxicity, right? So everything's kind of based on benzoapyrene, and either it's a higher toxicity or a lower toxicity compared to it. But the Minnesota, I just wanted to point out that the Minnesota Department of Health, the links that are provided to their website no longer work. And on their website, they say that guidance is outdated and it has been removed. So I think it would be good to update it. I'm not pointing out any errors within it. I'm just saying it's probably something that needs to be fixed. So
Dave, you want to jump
in? Yeah, we noticed that too. It seems to have been a pretty recent change. So yes, we're aware of it now, and we agree it needs to be addressed for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Travis. Other thoughts, reflections, additional comments from our Monday TRV discussion? Okay. I'm not seeing any hands. This will not be the last time. We'll have a final roundtable, so if things do come up as we move through the conversation today, we can come back into that space. But certainly it's been said several times, we had a robust conversation on Monday, so I appreciate what folks brought to the space. And if other things come up, Deborah, jump in before we move on. Deborah, if you're talking to us, you're on mute.
Apologies.
No
I
worries.
just I wasn't sure if this was the right place to discuss it, but I also wanted to raise the TRV for arsenic. The current value is, I believe, consistent with EPA's value from 1995, which is quite similar to the OEHA value from that same time frame. And it's based on two epidemiological studies that they've used to combine and calculate risk. And I wanted to point out that more recently, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, has done a new analysis in which they took the same two epidemiological studies, but with more recent follow-ups, meaning that the authors looked for additional cases of lung cancer among the workers with time. And then they also included an additional larger cohort. And using that analysis, you really improve the amount of statistical power in the calculation. And so it's newer. I think it's more refined, clearly more robust statistically. And I wanted to know whether or not OHA, in consultation with ATSAC, would review that newer study and consider revising the TRV for arsenic cancer.
So I don't know if that's a today answer, Dave, but maybe a submittal in writing, but I'll let you answer if you feel it's today question.
Yeah, I can't make it. I can't make a decision on the spot about what we would do, but I would encourage you to submit that in writing for sure.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks, Deborah. Thanks for naming that. Okay, being patient for additional hands, additional thoughts. Okay. Mary's thinking. Okay, let's move into our conversation. Like I said, we're gonna have time at the end to kind of do a wrap up of the last couple days discussion. So if things do come up as we have this conversation or things pop in your head, or you'd like to raise them later, please do. So Mike, I think I'm gonna pass it to you and move to our conversation around risk-based concentration.
Okay, so the development of RBCs or risk-based concentrations, we discussed that in the first Rules Advisory Committee meeting in January, and we went over how to combine the toxicity information and exposure information to calculate the RBCs. This was also reviewed in a bit more detail in a recent YouTube video prepared for the RAC. Plus, we prepared some supplemental materials shown on the next slide. So let's take a look at those. We had the supporting memo developed for the early life adjustment factors and the multi-pathway adjustment factor updates. So that is our documentation now of the revisions that we made and the sources of the values that were used. And importantly, there's the spreadsheet tool for the multi-pathway adjustment factors that was developed by ERG, that's Eastern Research Group, the same contractor we used for reviewing the TRVs. And in the spreadsheet there, it documents all the equations that are used, tables with all the parameter values. So that's, again, additional support that can be reviewed. And we're also looking for that spreadsheet as a potential use in the cases where we may want to do site-specific calculations. So again, all that kind of background material is out there, and I think that's all I'll say about it now, and turn it over to Ben to facilitate discussions on the adjustment factors and the development of the RBCs.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So certainly as we open the conversation, if you have clarifying questions for Mike, please ask those. We have a number of discussion questions, so we'll kind of go in order, and then we'll have a roundtable kind of on the questions or content as a whole. So the first discussion that we're hoping to have with you all is around information that the agencies should consider regarding toxicity modifications. And the icons, I guess, related to the lungs, to stomach, to skin, so pathways. Patricia, jump in.
Yeah, this is more of a question than a comment. I spent some time trying to figure out where the adjustments were made to account for sensitive populations like your 88-year-old Latino guy with COPD. And I understand that those were way upstream, maybe done at the EPA level or at Cal EPA level, but they certainly aren't in this discussion that I can find. But can you tell me where that process happened, and so that I can look into it further?
Okay, so there's a couple of pieces there. The inhalation TRVs, which is what OHA developed and we talked about in the last meeting, those are based on the most sensitive endpoint. Usually it's like infants, children, but that's in order to protect the most sensitive members of society, that's one place, a big place where that occurs. So it's already embedded in the derivation of the TRV, the toxicity values. In addition, when we look into the exposure, there are cases where we will look at the segment of society that has the highest exposure. And a good example of that is contact with soil. That's often, young children who are out playing in the backyard and getting soil on their hands and incidental ingestion. And this applies mainly to non-cancer effects. So we look specifically at that segment of society when we're developing and incorporating our exposure assumptions. And that is covered it should be in the supplemental materials and also in the spreadsheet showing that, for instance, the 0 to 2-year-olds we look at and this is the multi-pathway, we're looking at contact to soil through them. And also, I think, plant consumption. So I think both of those elements, then the protectiveness for sensitive members is part of both the TRV selection and also the exposure assumptions. I hope that helps.
Well, yeah. So what I understand then is that OHA did that work, and maybe we can pursue this offline. I just wanted to have a more detailed understanding of what went into those considerations, how that work was done.
Well, yeah, so it is part of the TRVs. The TRVs are based on the most sensitive endpoints, wherever that may be, for the different studies that were performed. So that's a big piece. And then the other piece of exposure is covered when we calculate the RBCs from the TRVs. And those are spelled out. And again, I'll point to the 0 to 2-year-olds for soil contact as one of the exposure assumptions that we make to make sure that we're protecting sensitive members of society.
David, do you want to jump into it called OHA?
Yeah, I can add a little bit. So when possible, agencies choose studies to use that include like a sensitive population, like developmental studies in particular. The experimental unit would be like a pregnant animal, and then they look for effects in the offspring. The exposure happens in utero, and then they look for effects in the offspring. So that is kind of like an intentional way that many times they try to look at the most sensitive kind of endpoint, the most sensitive group. But it's not always possible given the data that we have. And so another way that's more crude is that most of the TRVs have built into them what we call an uncertainty factors, and they're usually it's just a blanket tenfold factor that's usually applied for, we call it intra-species variability. So that's like human to human variability. And so it's usually just a factor of 10, and that assumes that the most sensitive person in a population, for whatever reason, like whatever it is about them that makes them more sensitive, might be 10 times more sensitive than the average person. That's kind of the almost all of the TRVs have. The only reason we wouldn't have one is if the study was in humans in the most sensitive group. So then you might not need one, but almost all of the TRVs have that uncertainty factor baked into it, which is meant to provide that kind of safety buffer and it's like I say, it's not specific to like why someone would be more sensitive. It just assumes that the most sensitive person might be 10 times more sensitive than average for whatever reason, whether that's because of ethnicity or because of life stage or pre-existing conditions or whatever.
Thanks, Dan. Does that get? Oh, Mike.
I might want to build on that too. So Dave's been talking about the TRVs are for inhalation. The consideration of adding, and this is for non-cancer, adding the uncertainty factor for sensitive members that, particularly if they're testing rats and mice, or that there may be, within the species, there may be more sensitive members. Anyway, get to my point here. That's also applied for the oral toxicity values that are used in the multi-pathway adjustment. So we have the inhalation one, which is the big deal. That was the big update. But in addition, for the multi-pathway chemicals, where we're looking at these other pathways, we pull in, and I'll call them TRVs, toxicity values that are related, though, to oral and dermal exposure. And those also include an adjustment for sensitivity to make sure that we're covering sensitive members of the population.
Right. Thank you. Trisha, does that answer your question? Or give you a...
Yeah, in part, and maybe I'll just do some email follow-up just to satisfy myself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And there might be some other places in this conversation where your question has some additional applicability. And maybe it'll be helpful just, for the group. I know we're being deliberate about the questions and we can move in order, but maybe giving you a preview of the conversation we want to have. So we have a suite of questions. And so hopefully this will prompt our future conversations. This first one was really around the toxicity modifications. If you go to the next slide. We're interested in understanding additional information in consideration for incidental soil ingestion. If you go to the next slide. Regarding gastrointestinal factors and discussion around that. Next slide. And then around plant uptake and ingestion rates. And then next slide. Around the agency's consideration for separating kind of child, non-resident child and non-resident adult workers. And then is there one more? And then information that the agencies consider regarding the early life adjustment factors. And then we'll do a roundtable. So just previewing kind of the suite of specific questions that we're interested in moving through. So going back to the first discussion, just wanted to reopen it up for around toxicity modifications, comments, thoughts, questions for clarity.
And Ben, I do want to just say, I know this is really in the weeds, technical details. So please, if anybody would like to sort of clarify some clarifying questions on what we're actually asking on these slides, please feel free to ask that as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, we can always come back. Let's go to the next slide, and so we'll kind of just move slide by slide and see if any develop some specific consideration. So this next piece is around incidental soil ingestion rates. Mike, anything to add before folks jump in?
Oh, maybe just real quick that we the previous model that we used from California South Coast Air Quality Management District, even for non-cancer, averaged in soil ingestion over a long period of time. And kind of standard practice is that we want to focus in on the segment of society that has the highest soil ingestion rates so that we're catching the most exposed, most sensitive members. And so that's an adjustment that we made.
Thanks, Mike. Deborah?
Thanks, Mike. So when I look at the MPFA AF, my bad, model, there are soil ingestion rates for every age group. And are those values, are those the median or the mean? They don't, it's unclear to me of the upper 95 percentile.
Of the ingestion rates for the different age groups?
Yes.
Yeah, and to clarify, so this isn't so I didn't confuse it with what I first said. We do, for cancer, for instance, we do include long-term exposure. So we're looking at ingestion rates over various age groups. And then for the non-cancer, we focus in on the one with the highest rate. So just that wasn't your question, but I just wanted to clarify that. And then for the individual rates, I think we're using an upper percentile for those. I can check on the spreadsheet and make sure that I'm saying that correctly. It should be documented, and so I don't want to misstate. Fumbling around looking for it now.
Okay. I mean, I couldn't find it on the spreadsheet. And I spent quite a bit of time looking for that type of detail. So if you know what page it's on the spreadsheet, that would perhaps help me.
And then that's helpful. So let's do some work behind the scenes and see if we can track down that information. Deborah, is there a different concern depending on whether it's a median or 95th percentile? Like, did you have a comment
I just
on
wanted
that?
to know
Okay.
because it wasn't clear.
Yeah.
I do have a follow-up question though, based on what Mike just said. So Mike, you said you used the highest soil ingestion rate for non-cancer. Does that apply to acute and chronic? And then you used long-term average for cancer?
Yes, that long-term averaging for the cancer, and then because the non-cancer, we assume it's up to a lifetime, but greater than a year of exposure. So that would apply. We'd look at a specific age area for that. So I believe what you said was correct interpretation. Yes.
Okay, can I ask one more question? It's
Sure.
not clear to me how that's consistent then with using deposition quantification in the model for 70 years. Because if you're using it over 70 years, then you're not going to be assuming that a person is a child for 70 years, right? Or maybe I'm just not understanding the model. I mean, it's complicated. There clearly is, code in there that seems to be hidden. I mean, or macros, I should say. So I just want to know if you guys, if I'm interpreting that right.
Actually, I don't think we used any macro. We're trying to make everything open and transparent. But regardless, the deposition part of it is over a long period of time, and then you're left with a concentration in soil, and that's what for the child being exposed. It's the deposition over a long period of time.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Crystal?
Yeah, I just wanted to express that I think some of these questions would be better submitted in writing to give DEQ a chance to look at any formulas. But I think, these things are complicated, but they're also not that complicated. Like it's deposited in the soil and then there's an exposure. Like, no, I don't think the child is being exposed for 70 years as a child, but like it's going to be in the soil for that longer time. So I think, just wanted to emphasize like having a good process and having those questions up front, and appreciate all the work that went into all of it.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. So I think there's a twofold opportunity here. One, to your point, right, certainly if there's very technical questions that can be submitted in writing for clarity, that would be really helpful just to digest the information. And of course, we'll continue to encourage folks to ask for clarity in order to be able to give the type of input that's most effective. Thank you, Crystal. Mary?
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to take a little bit out of the theoretical, because I think we should remember that Clean Air Oregon didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a community crisis in our air program and air toxics program around the invisibility and then, not assessing this. And one of the most significant drivers that, really created the opportunity to create Clean Air Oregon was the deposition of very harmful toxics next to an industrial facility that had been underregulated at a daycare. And so I think that this is not an exercise in theory. I think this is a practical, creating a systemic protection in our program for something that has been a real experience in our community that created a lot of trauma, frankly, for those parents and frankly for the business and for everybody. So this isn't a theoretical exercise, and I just think would like to remind folks about that.
Thank you, Mary. Jeff?
Thanks, Ben. I just wanted to better understand the process by which written questions might be answered in advance of proposed rulemaking, Ben. So that if the questions that Deb is asking really is, at this point, the materials are not able to be followed to understand how assumptions were incorporated into deposition rate adjustments. If we could get answers to those questions before proposed rulemaking, so that that would impact what comments might be made on those proposed rules, that would be super helpful. I mean, I appreciate the point that other members made in terms of perhaps some of these questions ought to be posed in writing to give the agencies time to reflect. But at this time, what I think Tox Strategies was trying to communicate effectively is that the materials provided are not yielding a clear answer to the questions asked. So we'd love to have answers to those questions in advance of proposed rules so that we could, again, react and note what those answers are.
Sure. JR, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a great question. And what I've been reflecting on since our last meeting is that I think it makes sense to potentially offer some office hours again between this meeting and the next, so that we can follow up and get those answers to you and make sure that we can kind of have that walkthrough of the tool. It is complicated, but it should be all explicit, and we should be able to trace all dependents through all of that. So I think maybe we'll circle back, and I feel like we're probably going to end up offering that to folks. So that hopefully will be a good avenue. It worked previous to this one, and then I believe we're going to have a period after our last meeting where folks can submit comments up to a deadline, and then if there are some really challenging follow-ups, we might be able to kind of meet and discuss those, our responses, or clarify what is being asked by the RAC member.
Do you have a follow-up, Jeff?
I just wanted to say thank you.
Okay. Appreciate that. Mary, is that a new hand or an old hand? I think that means an old hand. Mike, did you want to ask something or add something?
Yeah, just as far as the documentation, and like JR said, I think it is important that we answer questions before the rulemaking. So in the spreadsheet, like I said, all the equations should be in there, not hidden. And I think in the video, I highlighted the equation for the deposition to soil. It's an integral function, so it's a little bit complicated. And the derivation or the original source of that is from South Coast Air Quality Management District and their risk assessment guidance document. So we might have to refer to materials from others because there's a lot that goes into all those equations. But that's what we used in the original. We used their work in the original rulemaking, and in the case now, we're just taking the same equations, the same documentation that we're using with the modifications that we've been talking about, like the age groups. But for instance, the soil deposition, we're using the same model that South Coast used. So it's depositing emissions over time to the soil, and then we're looking at the exposure after that lengthy deposition has occurred. So again, we probably want to follow up with a little more detail there, but we do refer to these sources and should explicitly show the equations and all the input parameters that are being used.
Yeah, and I think to Deborah's point, and I think the ask and commitment from DEQs, if having said all of that, if there are still questions or something that's missing that needs clarity, please submit that in writing. I think JR, you committed to making sure that either through office hours and or written responses that will make sure that that commitment to transparency and seeing how showing your work is there. Deborah, I saw you're off mute. Did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. Thank you. And Crystal, I saw a hand flash and then come down. Did you want to jump in?
No, I think it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Again, this is these hope for these conversations, and I get to JR's point, it is a bit in the lead. But if there's information that agencies could be considering regarding incidental soil ingestion, I'll just ask one more round and then we'll keep going. Okay, let's Deborah.
Sorry, I just thought of another question. So for soil ingestion rates for some chemicals in the calculator, there is an absorption fraction for soil ingestion, and for arsenic, it's the default that EPA and Cal EPA use, which is 60%. But when you get to the RBC level, I assume that you could also do additional testing of arsenic emissions to determine site-specific bioaccessibility or relative bioavailability. And I would assume you would do that based on like collection of particles from emissions rather than from soil. And have you guys thought about that at all?
So this would be not our default calculation for RBCs. What you're, I think, referring to would be a consideration for a level 4 full-on risk assessment where we take into account modifications beyond the default assumptions. And
Got it. I get
that
it.
can
Thanks,
be,
Mike.
so yeah, separate from the default calculation of RBCs, a level 4 risk assessment, we can because it takes some effort to evaluate all additional information, but that can be done through that process through a level 4 risk assessment. And in fact, it was done, and that actually served as the reason when it was about arsenic in soil. We looked at that and did a level 4 risk assessment and said, that's kind of a standard assumption now. It hasn't always been. Maybe we should incorporate that into our default if we're confident. If EPA was confident enough years ago to revise their, and this again, a detail that I haven't really gotten into for the people who aren't following this conversation, but we are modifying the amount of arsenic that actually gets into a body through incidental soil ingestion. EPA made a default assumption of 60% a number of years ago, and we decided to incorporate that into our default. But any other modifications would require a site-specific risk assessment.
All right. Thank you. Crystal, then Mary.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that's absolutely an important point. If we had more robust funding for DEQ and were able to actually test the soil, I think we could really arrive at a more accurate number. These, by necessity, have to be modeled numbers, right? So we're looking at the modeling of what we think a particular facility is putting out and what we think is depositing on soil, and we're ignoring the fact that there's multiple facilities in a row that are all depositing potentially bioaccumulative compounds all in the same area, not to mention historic uses, previous agricultural uses, and any other deposition. And so I think if we did have some funding dedicated to testing the soil, we might find that the levels are in fact not protective enough. So I would welcome additional testing to really get at those more exact numbers and more protective data.
We'll capture that as something the agency can consider in future discussions. Mary, jump in.
Yeah, I guess, Crystal, that was really well said. I was sort of having a reaction a little bit again on, I'm imagining the real world situation where this occurred and trying to figure out what tools in the toolbox DEQ could have had to, I think, give more immediate action and better clarity to communities, and frankly, hopefully prevent the trauma and anxiety that was created when the contamination was found after what was an undisclosed, unknowable period of time of exposure at that point regarding the discovery of arsenic specifically, as well as chrome-6 and others in the soil at the daycare center across from the glass manufacturer. So, in terms of real-world application, I guess I would just ask that we continue to have this conversation today about how we continue to create and build the most health protective tools for analysis and risk analysis. And what I'm hearing from Deborah often is the complexity of implementation. And while I am open to continue to learn more about that from industry standpoint, I think this process is meant to be pure science to establish the risk. And the complexity of implementation, I just welcome industry to the world that community has lived in, which can be frustrating and unclear. But I think that implementation piece of this should be separated out, and we have that conversation later.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Let's move to the next, and we will have a roundtable, so we'll all be able to come back. Jeff, let's preview the next slide, and then Jeff, why don't you jump in?
Just wanted to react to the last comment a little bit, that the unfortunate circumstance that gave rise to the Cleaner Air Oregon program should not excuse the scientists that are working now to implement and develop that program from making use of best available science. And there are complexities in the application of the science that reflect policy decisions, not just pure science. In addition, I'd like to point out that the OHA's analysis and health risk assessment of that facility's impact and potential impact on humans following that experience, I think should have allayed certain concerns in that the OHA found in a public health assessment, its final public health assessment, that concentrations of metals measured in soil around that facility were unlikely to harm people's health in the area. And so it was an incredibly traumatic event, but emotional harm and outrage should not influence a scientific inquiry. And so I wanted to come in defense of Deb's point of view here. What Tuck Strategy is trying to do is to better understand the scientific decision-making processes and to call to attention potential new avenues for evaluation. And what I continue to harp on in this Rulemaking Advisory Committee discussion is that we ought to prioritize public health but the rules require as well that we balance that prioritization with the need to ensure that there's a thriving business community, because jobs also are important to health. And so what we ought to do, where we find values that could meaningfully impact businesses, i.e. put them down or under or affect their operation, is make really careful choices about whether we're executing on the best available science. And that's all that we're trying to do. No one here is trying to, from the regulated community's perspective, ignore the legitimate justification for the Cleaner Air Oregon program. Neither is anyone attempting to sort of use nuance to distract from correct public health outcomes. So I'm sort of sick of the insinuation that that's happening, Ben. I don't believe that that's what's happening in this conversation, and I would ask that you better facilitate it.
Thanks, Jeff. So why don't we pause for a second, because what I would like us, I appreciate that challenge, and I do think we're getting into a place that is starting to assume intent and motivation versus interest-based perspectives. And so I'm going to ask folks to speak from your interest-based perspectives, right, and to focus in on kind of what we're here to do, right? If there are considerations for the agency in the development of rules, if there's considerations and legitimate curiosity or clarification around the science, let's please name that. I do, Jeff, to your point, and I'll just ask folks collectively to reflect back on our group agreements, right? Let's talk about the issues. Let's talk about the science, the information, and really try to avoid trying to assume kind of what folks are bringing to the table and why they're doing that, right? There's obviously interest-based perspectives around this room. So I'll hold that, and I'll ask you all to hold it, right? We're deliberately trying to advise the DEQ on rules that really do have to serve multiple interests for this state, right? So I'll just leave it at that. Crystal, I'll bring you in. Thanks, Jeff, for saying that and challenging me, and I'll just ask folks to hold that collectively. Crystal, jump in.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to attempt to hold that collectively, but also use this as a bit of an opportunity to respond, because I think the process also requires balance. I wanted to just emphasize that the ATSAC process specifically was conducted to avoid any conflicts of interest. That means it had scientific integrity from folks who did not have any interest in the outcome. And I just want to emphasize that OHA has no reason to overemphasize any health risks. And the risks that we've discussed do represent real people, real outcomes. And of course, people are rightfully concerned about those health outcomes. And I think when there's something that having an emotion behind it is a normal and natural human response. We spoke extensively about diesel exhaust, for example. Benzene, which is part of diesel emissions, increases the risk of acute myeloid leukemia. And just last summer, I went to the funeral of a family friend who was diagnosed and then passed away from acute myeloid leukemia within a matter of weeks. And, these are people with families, with people who depend on them. And I just want to emphasize that caring about people and the people behind the numbers does not indicate a lack of scientific reason.
No, that's fair, Crystal. And again, I am not going to ask folks to not bring emotion into this space. What I'll ask is that we're not assuming whether someone cares or an entity cares or an interest-based perspective cares about public health or economic development, et cetera. So again, I'm going to try to focus folks in on kind of the questions that we're really trying to uncover to advise the agency on how these rules can meet their purpose. Jeff, come back to you. I think that's a new hand, Jeff, right?
Was it intended to be? I appreciate your response.
Yeah, all right, thank you. So with all that said, centering back in on this question around information that the agencies should consider regarding gastrointestinal factors. Their thoughts or reflections on. Yeah, Deborah. Nope, you're muted. There you go.
Sorry, my clicking is below average today. So thanks. So I looked at the tool and looked at the absorption factors. As I noted before, I noted that the arsenic value was 0.6. I also looked at lead and noticed that the absorption factor was 1, but I think there is a default absorption factor for lead similar to arsenic. I think it's 0.6 as well, that could be considered in the MPAF tool. So I just wanted to raise that. And then I was a little bit confused if this is used for the acute TRV or is it only used for chronic?
Empaths are for chronic, not acute.
Thanks.
Is that just a clarification question, or did you have kind of
Well, I was
considerations
also
based?
asking about the use of 1 versus 0.6, or if that's been researched by ODEQ.
I think you should make that comment and we can respond if you're advocating for using a different accumulation for lead.
Okay, it's actually the absorption factor that I was
Absorption
talking
factor.
about.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Getting ahead of myself here.
Appreciate it. We'll keep moving through the slides and then we will have open discussion. So if we can go to the next topic, information around consideration for plant uptake and plant ingestion rates. Yep, Deborah.
You're probably going to tell me to write a comment about this, but a question. But it's not clear to me that it looks like the vegetable ingestion rates are modified from what was the rates that were used earlier. And so I was wondering what the modification was based on, if we're talking about using different percentiles. They're not very significantly different, but they are somewhat different. And if y'all don't know off the top of your head, that's fine. But if you do know, I was just hoping to get an answer.
Yes, and yes. So the question is, I believe, restating this, that we're using in our ingestion rates for now plant, not soil. We're talking about uptake in the plants and then ingestion of the plants, that we modified the default assumptions that were used originally, and again, based on South Coast Air Quality Management District. And yes, we did. We looked at, and part of this was based on our experience doing some site-specific work, that two things. One, we wanted to focus, just like soil ingestion, we wanted to focus on the age group that had the highest exposure, so we're hitting the most sensitive. But the other piece was that, and some of the information here is from OHA and also probably maybe ATSDR on their standard assumptions for ingestion of produce, plants and that from your garden, is that there's higher, so we're using upper percentiles, but there's greater uncertainty at the high range. And we felt for an overall reasonable maximum that was too uncertain, and that following the advice of the health agencies, that we would use as a default the 75th percentile. So not like a mean, but an upper percentile, but not the highest upper percentile of the 95th, because we felt that was better justified. So we went down from the 95th percentile that was used previously as a default to the 75th percentile. We felt that was appropriate based on uncertainty and also still protected.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and as our crack team from DEQ and OHA, if there's things that we can reference as we did last time, we'll try to find those references and put it in the chat as a resource for the group. Any other comments around the uptake and ingestion rates for plants? Not seeing any hands. Let's keep going to the next slide. So separating child and worker empaths. Deborah?
I think that's the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Simple and straightforward. That's the simplest comment of so far. I appreciate that. Any other kind of thoughts or reflections? So could be, right, is that the right approach, as Deborah just reflected, or if there's anything else that the agencies should really be thinking about or considering? Being as patient as I can get for hands. Let's keep moving. Next slide. Information consideration for use of early life adjustment factors. Deborah?
So I did have a question about the early life adjustment factors, and I see that they are consistent with the values developed by OWIHA, which OWIHA calls age sensitivity factors, that is. But they are, and so they are not consistent with the values that EPA developed, which they call age-dependent adjustment factors. And I just was wondering about the discussions around the choice of which values to use.
Okay, I may not understood that. I mean, slightly different terms, but the values are the the uh, the factors that are being used are the same as EPA's. That's what we're using. Was that
Oh, okay.
your
I thought
question
that
that,
they were.
that's different than OEHA?
Yeah, OWIHA has slightly different factors than EPA. I thought the factors that were being used were OWIHA's factors, but I'll have to double check that.
Okay, I'll check to see if OEHA is different, but regardless, we're using EPA's
Okay, thank you.
factors.
Thank you.
And for those of you who may not be following all the technical stuff here, that just means that at certain age, and this is for cancer now, so we look at factors for what's the risk of cancer over an extended, like lifetime, say a lifetime exposure for certain chemicals, and there's only a few of them that they've decided that the impact to infants and children, there's a greater impact. And so you can't just use the factor that we're applying for, say, long term, like an adult. And so like it's 10 times worse if you're exposed from 0 to 2 years old, and 3 times worse if you're a 2 year old, I think up to 16. There's a couple age groups, but they're both the same factor. So those are the numbers that Deborah was talking about. Is these age adjustment factors where we're saying if you're exposed during this portion of your lifetime, it's worse than if you're exposed as an adult. And we take those numbers from EPA, those factors.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, Nadesh?
Mike, can you talk a little bit about how in utero exposure is represented in the risk calculations, or is it in kind of this early life adjustment factor calculations as well, or is it represented somewhere else?
Okay, I barely heard that. I think
It
it
was
had
a,
to
it was
do
a
with
question
what
about how in utero
in
factors were
utero.
considered. Yep.
Not directly here, no. It's we look at early life meaning and including breastfeeding of infants. And then the TRVs may be based on the inhalation TRVs may be based on developmental effects which could occur in utero. But for the adjustments that we're making for the multi-pathway and early life, that's only as infants and beyond, not for the fetus.
But there are some, there are doses in the third trimester assumed, correct? Though I think I see that in your calculation tool. So
that was
there
part
is some
of
in there.
the what South Coast Air Quality Management District, California did. But I don't think it really affects the calculations here.
No, I'm not saying it's for the early life adjustment factors. I'm just saying there are places where you're taking that into account otherwise, though, right?
I'm not
Mike,
sure it
I
has a
think
big impact.
it shows a third trimester early life adjustment factor of 10 from what I'm looking at.
So, yeah, Mike, well, let's come back to maybe look into that and come back to the question. I think Nadej, just to put a point on your question, that's you were asking whether it was included, and then am I to assume that you would like the agency to consider that? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
At this point,
Are
I'm
you
just trying
asking
to
me?
better
No,
understand.
Nadej, Deborah, sorry.
Yep, thanks, Ben. I'm just trying to understand at this point, not making any sort of formal comment. Thanks.
Okay, good, thank you. So let's get to this. Yeah, Mike.
We can look at the impact of doing that. I mean, we did follow that from the original calculations. I'm just thinking that it may not have the same impact that we're looking at for the early life adjustment. But we'll look in more detail at that.
Thanks, Mike. Molly?
Thank you. I actually had a question on this too, and it might be too technical for here, in which case I can follow up in an office hour. But in setting kind of the risk-based standards, you have to kind of consider the exposure and then also the intake factors. And so the question around the early life adjustment factors is actually around those intake factors and where you pulled those, or did you pull those from a specific source? Because the EPA does not include child intake factor the adjustment factor, or the intake rates are not necessarily child-based is kind of the technical point. So I'm just curious a little bit more about how these were derived and where they came from.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not quite following here. So the intake rates, what are you referring to there?
Yeah, so the intake rates, ingestion, dermal absorption, inhalation. When you're a small child, your breathing rate is faster than an adult. So depending on how you set your intake rate default influences the ultimate exposure value that you calculate to then take into a consideration the toxicity factor that is derived from either the animal model or the epidemiology model. So it's kind of, it's the toxicity times the exposure, and the exposure has that intake rate baked into it. So is that intake rate for adults, or does it also include or adjusted for children?
So, and I may not still be getting to your question here, but I'll try with a couple of approaches here. So for the soil ingestion, which you talked about earlier, we have that by different age groups, like 0 to 1, 0 to 2. And so that is the exposure piece there. Is your question about the inhalation?
Yeah, within the other ingestion and inhalation specifically, are you also taking into consideration that age-specific intake rate?
Well, yeah, the other ingestion would be like the produce, and that is, we do have that by age group. For the inhalation, which is covered in our kind of the standard, you don't need multi-pathway for that, but for all of the chemicals that we're looking at for inhalation, it's concentration based as opposed to relative to body weight and in inhalation rate, or excuse me, yeah, I guess inhalation rate. We used to do it that way, that we would have in the terms of the the dose in milligrams of the chemical per kilogram of body weight per day, and that also included like how much air you would breathe in that. But that's been our current approach is to use just the air concentration. Same for children or adults. We base the risk on the air concentration.
Does that answer your question, Molly?
And independent of the inhalation rate.
Yeah, I think I need to maybe talk with Mike in an office hour to dig into that a little, just so that I understand where you're coming from this. So yeah, I can follow up.
I guess like
Yeah, that's fine.
I guess like Molly and if, like, I'm trying to get this question from folks, like, is there a consideration that you're hoping for that maybe you're not seeing? Like, I guess, is that the way to ask the question? Like,
I think my question is more specific to being able to see the technical math per se, because it might be baked in there of what I'm thinking, but if not, the question here is, or what is driving my question here
yeah,
is that intake rates for children are higher than adults because of the body mass size and also respiration and all of that kind of stuff. In Red Book risk assessment modeling kind of things, you can do age-adjusted components, and where kind of the question with the TLBs and the concentration, and I think the point that Mike is making is that that has actually been taken into consideration. But as somebody who kind of needs to see the math to to be able to follow the argument, that is the technical follow-up that I'm curious about. Because if not, kids do eat,
yeah.
breathe, and ingest more than adults.
That's what, yeah, thank you, Matt. I mean, that's what I was trying to elicit, right, is the motivation kind of behind the question. And then I think there is follow-up for whether it's office hours or a written comment that can make sure that you have the ability to analyze the actual calculation behind it. Mike, did you want to?
Yeah, so we probably do need, a separate technical office hour, whatever discussion about this. I don't think, if I understand what I think you're asking for, I don't think we're doing it that way, because that's just not the typical approach used now in risk assessment. It has been done, and I think even California, because their original guidance was a number of years ago, takes child body weight and inhalation rates into account. But the current basis for our risk assessments in air is just concentration based as opposed to dose in a milligram per kilogram per day basis.
I'm gonna chalk this up to a follow-up conversation. So, well, just so you all can get on the same page and ensuring that you're getting the information, Molly, that you're seeking here. Any other comments on this? Otherwise, I'm going to move us to a round table and just kind of open it up more broadly to the group. Okay, let's just go to the next slide. And just open up a roundtable discussion on the risk-based concentrations and adjustment factors. So, if there are additional technical comments or questions, certainly if there's broader questions, considerations that you'd like the agency to hear as part of this roundtable, I'd love to invite folks in. Yeah, is it Paula? His hand is raised. Is that an audience member's hand? That seems like an audience member's hand, sorry. So for those in the audience, you do have the ability to raise your hand. We will open up space for any public input towards the end of the meeting. So, Paula, you won't be invited to interact with the group at this time. Travis?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the right spot. I think it might be covered under RBCs. It's kind of related to RBCs, but one thing that's been undertaken as a part of this rulemaking is all of the new priority list tax um, and there's a handful of new changed ones. The hazard index of 3 or 5 is also being adjusted or assigned for those. And I'll say that on the charter for this rack, that being a part of the change is not discussed. It's kind of seems like it was kind of an afterthought or kind of hidden away. You do have a document that kind of explains how you do this, but last time after the first rules came out, there was a whole separate rulemaking about how you were going to decide whether something was a 3 or a 5, and then making that decision about what which chemicals had a hazard index of 3 or 5. And in this case, it's not something that we've discussed at all. It wasn't a part of any of the presentation materials, and so it just I wanted to point out that it's kind of been skimmed over. At least that's the way it appears to me. There's discussion about ones that are being assigned, about how they're being I guess designated a 3 or a 5. And I noticed on one of them N-propylbenzene, it talks about how ethylbenzene is a surrogate for that, and it has developmental effects. And to me, you're assigning TRV values based on ethylbenzene for N-propylbenzene, so you're using that as a surrogate. But then to also use that as a surrogate here and to say, oh, we're going to assume that it must have developmental effects as well, just seemed a little inappropriate maybe to me. I haven't done the science research into that compound, but it just there were a handful of others where there's some evidence of developmental effects listed as the reason, but there's not a lot of detail. There's not a lot of work shown about how those designations were made, and I just wanted maybe is there somewhere that you guys have more detail about how those decisions were made? Is that documented somewhere else, or is this kind of the spot for it in the derivation table? So that's what I wanted to bring up. Thanks.
JR, do you want to start and then
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. No, Travis, great flag. And thank you for digging into all this. So yeah, I think what we are looking for is comments on that as well. I think we didn't flag any of those in particular because we had the established methodology that we were using based on that, as you mentioned, the HI3, HI5 rulemaking. And that was something that was not part of this rulemaking to adjust any of that or to seek reapproval of a different methodology. So we use that methodology to designate the 3 and 5 chemicals. And so, yeah, this is an absolutely here or at any other time is a perfect time to discuss this and to flag this. And so, yeah, please submit that in writing. I am going to turn it over, though, to one of the toxicologists because I do think the references, I think we do have some of those reference materials. It just might be hopping from link to link in some of the documents, but I will stop talking and turn it over.
Dave, you want to jump? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the details that I think that you're looking for are in the supplemental materials part of the rules webpage. That there's one of the resources is called HI3, HI5 derivation. It's a spreadsheet, And
Yeah.
that's where that's where we and the criteria that we used. I think that one of the columns in that spreadsheet says what the like by which criterion it qualifies as an HI3. So yeah, so it's like JR said, like we were applying methodology and criteria that were established in previous rulemaking to the new chemicals. So,
yeah. So I see that, and I see there's a comments column in that workbook, and there's not a lot of detail in there, so it's kind of hard for someone, in the public and all to say, okay, it says, for example, for Freon 113, which I have no idea if anyone's really emitting, right? This is not targeted at anyone. It says some evidence of developmental effects following high dose inhalation exposures. Well, how would anyone know how do we check that work? There's not like a column what references a study. There's not a link to some study that you're develop. What is some evidence, right? Some evidence sounds like, well, it could be some not evidence, right? So I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah,
so that's all.
That's good feedback. I think we could make it more clear in the spreadsheet for sure. Like for a quick answer, in most cases, the method was to check for lowest observable effect level in ATSDR's health. The health effects section of their tox profiles has like a dose array figure for. This is like way in the weeds. Sorry. And I'm happy to talk more about this in office hours.
Meeting, right?
Yeah.
And this meeting is to talk through this. I think we keep delaying to some future meeting, but isn't that why we're here? So
yeah, and I'm happy to talk about it too in office hours for people. Like the reason I say that, the apologies for folks who don't have a background in this, it's hard to follow maybe. So
yeah, understood.
So if anyone feels the need to like some help catching up, I'm happy to talk about it in office hours as well. But yeah, like in most cases, the information that is referenced there is coming from an ATSDR tox profile for the chemical in that dose array figure, looking for lowest observable effect levels for a developmental effect or reproductive effect for any route of exposure.
And I guess, maybe Travis, to take this to its conclusion, right? I think, Dave, like where there are spaces, and you've heard some of these questions today, where there greater clarity, I'll say transparency, but I think it's really just documentation, right? Like, so what you just said, Dave, doesn't sound like, Travis, it's on that, right? Like that's on that spreadsheet. As clear as it could be.
Not a lot of detail. Yeah.
So. Okay. So I think that's just helpful feedback. And I think if others are seeing places where they would have the next question or the next kind of analysis that doesn't seem to be there, please submit those in writing, or that could be an office hours conversation. Crystal, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, having worked with government toxicologists extensively, I can say that the default is generally caution with these kind of statements rather than overstating claims. And this generally happens given industry pushback. So, the idea that an OHA toxicologist would be overstating or exaggerating is just not typical.
Yeah, I'm not implying anything. I'm saying it says some evidence of developmental effects at high doses. I don't know what that means, and there's not a reference to something else. So again, you don't need to attack industry for that.
If a government toxicologist says some evidence, there's probably a lot of evidence.
So yeah, I appreciate your comment. I just would say, right, folks in this space should be able to ask for information that maybe they would like to have. So I'll just hold that. Right, worked with the agency folks, y'all are great. What I hear from Travis and some of the other questions is just asking for the documentation that gets to the conclusion that are being made to inform and ultimately to set these rules. So appreciate the commentary and the trust of our colleagues around the table, and just really want to hold, what we're asking folks to give input on is what is the information like this. We're building rules based on information that is scientific, that does include math, that needs documentation, that's referencing lots of different things. So just want to really give permission for folks to ask the type of questions that will get to places of clarity or depth of understanding, whether you agree with the outcome or not. So I'll just leave it there for the moment. Patricia, jump in.
Yeah, I want to speak to that bigger point and preface my remarks by saying I don't mean to impugn anyone's motives here, but I think it might be very instructive for everyone on this committee to go back to the big Oregonian article on a fellow named Bob Posert, who took it upon himself to go through and analyze a 700-page environmental review of the proposed next refinery in Clatskanie. And I think it's very illustrative of the barriers that community members like myself and other people, well, I'll speak just for myself, that we don't have resources or consulting firms behind us helping us sort through these very technical and frankly intimidating issues. And my observation is that most of the technical discussion here is from industry representatives, not from the community members who, from my perspective, I'm baffled by much of the science. I'm not an expert in these areas. And I think that just needs to be taken into account when we I really appreciate that community members are invited into this process, but I feel like it's a very difficult space for non-environmental scientists to actually engage in a meaningful way. And I think that's a bit of a problem. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thanks for naming it. And I think you've heard comments around getting in the weeds and some real technical discussions of science and other kind of analytical discussion today. So Patricia, just appreciate you naming it. Certainly, I think some consideration for DEQ in both this process and future processes around how. Mary, I think you said the layperson, right? The layperson can engage meaningfully in this conversation. Some of it's just incredibly challenging. So just thank you for just naming that tension. Yeah, Mary came off mute. Did you want to jump in? No, or you came off video. Sorry, not off mute. Okay. All right. Just giving a head shake. All right. Other comments, reflections? Well, why don't we take a break? Just really appreciate, just pause just to appreciate folks. Like I know these conversations and, as a facilitator, always happy to be checked a little bit around how do we have this conversation in a way that I think Patricia, you said doesn't impugn motive. But you are all here because you represent an interest-based perspective that is trying to represent in the best way you can. So I just appreciate folks coming in that way and just appreciate the way that we've continued to navigate this conversation. So it is 10:29. I'm going to ask that we let's take 10 and a half minutes, come back at 10:40, and then we'll move into more specific conversation around the rule language updates, and then we'll move towards a final roundtable. We'll just invite folks in for some additional thoughts to close up this part of the process. So let's take 10 and we'll come back at 10:40. Yeah, this is your 1 minute countdown. Hey, welcome back, 10:40. We're going to move into some specific conversations around rule language updates. So, JR, I'm going to pass it to you, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm going to walk through the last discussion item for this rulemaking that we'll talk about today specifically. And so these are the proposed changes to the frequency that we perform this rulemaking or this for the priority list and TRV updates, as well as some flexibility regarding adjustments made to the multi-pathway adjustment factor calculations in very specific instances, or the MPAF. So based on the significant amount of work needed to review and propose the updates in this rulemaking, DEQ has determined that a 3-year schedule is not feasible or sustainable. We are proposing updates to the language in Division 247, Rule 40, for the process for updating the lists of priority toxic air contaminant lists and toxicity reference values for revising the schedule from every 3 to every 5 years. Additionally, we are proposing to include the or as necessary language, which is already included in the TRV review frequency language, in the priority list language for consistency. Let's review the proposed language. So here you can see the proposed edits as described for the priority list schedule language. The blue is added text and the red is deleted text. Again, you can see the additional quote, or as necessary, added language, and this was added to align with the current language in the rules for the TRV updates, which you'll see on the next slide. Also, the start date here, just as a minor, will be updated to reflect the rule adoption date and or any grace periods if these proposed changes are adopted by the Environmental Quality Commission or the EQC. Next slide. There we go. Okay. And then here is it's very straightforward. Here's the proposed 5-year updates. And you can see that the or as necessary language is currently in rule. Next slide. So as Mike noted in the MPAF discussion, we have made some updates to the underlying exposure assumptions used to calculate the MPAFs. In particular, for non-residential child exposure locations, this would be schools or daycares, DEQ is proposing to update these assumptions to align with DEQ and EPA risk assessment practices of using the most health protective and soil ingestion rates. This means that the assumptions will be based on the 0 to 2-year-old age range rather than an average value. We are proposing rule language updates that would allow more flexibility for sources performing risk assessments to modify this specific assumption. Currently in rule, a source would need to request to perform a level 4 risk assessment in order to make adjustments to exposure assumptions leading to the creation of the RBCs. This requires a significant cost increase relative to a level 3. We are proposing to allow sources to modify the age range for soil ingestion for non-residential exposure locations if there are only children of specified age ranges exposed at that location, without having to perform and pay for a level 4 assessment. And examples of this would be a middle school, a junior high, or high school that does not have daycare facilities for infants in the 0 to 2-year-old range. In these cases, we would allow adjustment of the soil ingestion age ranges from 0 to 2 to the appropriate age ranges at that location. Next slide. Here's the actual proposed language. It would be all new language under a new subsection of the rules covering modeling and risk assessment work plans in Division 210, in Rule 210. And you can read that here. I didn't highlight it blue because it's all new. So that's it for the proposed rule changes. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ben for discussion.
All right, thanks, JR. Let's go Crystal, Mary, Jeff.
Yeah, I wanted to start off. I have a few thoughts, but I wanted to start off considering the soil ingestion consideration. I'm wondering how that would account for young people with disabilities who are at the middle or high school level, whose behavior might still include some kind of ingestion type behaviors, or like more like contact with soil because of those developmental differences.
So, Mike, do you want to talk about kind of developmental disabilities in relationship to how that would apply?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the comment there. It's, I mean, something we could consider, but right now we're, it's intended for just the based on age groups. The typical soil ingestion that we have is, and again, it's conservative in the sense of a sort of an upper bound, but it doesn't include like I think pike is the term where kids eat a lot of eat soil, kind of almost as a you know a disease kind of thing, and so that's currently not included, but we can consider.
Thanks, Crystal. Mary.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on the 3 to 5 years with the questions to the agency regarding considering that the inability of the agency to meet the original 3-year deadline and the lack of consequences regarding that. I'm just trying to figure out what assurances you'll be in this rulemaking, what assurances can be put into the rules to assure that 5 years will happen. I mean, basically, we ended up with 5 years already. You're just stating kind of the practicability. But what I want to see is the enforceability of that. And what are you going to put into the rules to assure the public that this will happen in that period of time? And if it doesn't, what consequences can we be assured would apply?
Well, Mary, maybe there's two things here. So what I think I'm hearing is some level of accountability or consequence that holds the 5-year timeline to be an obligation. And then I think another question just around maybe for the agency, and I don't know if that's, maybe we just hold it as a comment and then ask, right, is to consider some level of accountability. But JR, do you have reflection for Mary's comment question?
Right. It's a good question. It's an interesting question. Well, so what I can say is that this is the first time we went through this process. There was a lot of infrastructure on our end that needed to get set up, which moving forward, I believe will not be the case. So we will find efficiencies on our end in that aspect of this. As far as what we put in the rule for accountability, we are open to hearing that feedback. I think right now the accountability is that if we don't meet these deadlines, I believe that we would be subject to challenge by external interested parties on that. And that to me, I don't know if there is another mechanism or a more stringent mechanism than that for having consequence, as you say. I mean, the consequences really, yeah. I think that's all I can say at this point, unless I've got anybody else on our side here that wants to chime in.
That's likely fair, JR. I mean, so Mary, just for follow up, right? That's maybe some written comment around potential language that can create accountability. Right, Ali, I see you just jumped on, so maybe you can speak to, it's a legitimate question around like how are you going to actually meet the obligations that are in rule on a timeline that's stated in rule. So Ali, maybe I'll ask you to comment, and then Mary, bring you back in, then we'll go to you, Jonah.
Uh, Thanks, Ben. What JR said, just sort of looking for comments on what would you like, what you'd like to see in a rule. I think that would be interested in hearing that. But I think there is a requirement for us to report to the commission. The commission and the director hold us accountable for making these. So I think it's aligned with our 5-year report to the commission as part of the program updates. So there is some something we can build in to ensure that that oversight exists there. They hold us accountable, but also open to, as JR said, any suggestion you have here. Appreciate it.
Good, Mary. Any?
Yeah, my follow-up would just be to respond to what JR just said regarding the institutional knowledge that DEQ has achieved and acquired during this process. So then it makes the fact that there could be efficiencies, you've gone through it, it makes it less clear to me then why you're making this recommendation at this point in the process without actually, are you making the recommendation on other points? Are you, it's clear to me, it seems obvious to me based on what has happened and how long this has taken that process is just the reason. But if there's other reasoning beside that you think are scientifically valid, that have to do with the integrity of the program, introducing the best and latest scientific information into our TRV determinations, that's what I'm most interested in. And that was what the intentionality, I think, around the 3-year window was based on the technical advisory groups and the rulemaking process, determining that was the most valid window for incorporating the best and latest scientific information. Are you saying that no longer holds? Are you reconsidering that window regarding the scientific integrity behind this, or is it a process point?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I can start that, and if others want to chime in here. Yes, I believe so. We have to balance things, Mary. So these rulemakings take a tremendous amount of staff time, and we have to balance that with implementing the program as well. The rate of science that progresses, we feel that 5 years is acceptable to maintain that. I would also like to point out that in the rules, we already do have the ability to perform this review and update as necessary if we do find that there is new science that shows that there's a new information that we really need to consider, either creating new stringency or relaxing. And so that language is in there to preserve that right for us to do that authority. But I do think it is a balance for us as far as the rate that we're seeing the science change and the rate that we can sustain these rulemakings.
Yeah, anything to add, Dave?
Well, I mean, I can say that it is a lot of work to do these, I guess I would just point to there's not, I would say, not a scientific formula that spits out the exact maximum, the optimum frequency of review. Like the research scientists that are doing science aren't like consulting us, so they're just always doing their work, and so it is basically a policy decision about like when we catch those snapshots, like whether it's 3 years or 5 years. I will say that no other agencies that I know of like do 3 years. Like when we first set up the program, I think we were looking at the example of some other federal agencies that have goals to do like every 5 or every 10 years, and then it ends up being longer than they said. And so we wanted to try to be above average in our frequency compared to other agencies that do this work. I think that's part of what is behind that. What was behind that original 3-year number, and yeah, I think maybe part of what we learned during this first round is that like it really does take 5 years to do.
Thanks, Dan. Mary, does that answer your? Okay. Let's go Jonah, then Crystal, then Jeff.
Thanks. Yeah, I was my question was about the or as necessary language that JR just referenced a minute ago. I do see that language in the TRV section there in the in that same regulatory section. But I guess I'm wondering, I guess first if DQ, if you have situations in mind right now that would trigger that additional review. And I guess, especially in light of the fact that you're proposing to push back the timeline from 3 to 5 years, I wonder if it would be wise to explicitly spell out what those situations might be in the rule itself to kind of add a little teeth to this.
And Jonah, you're referring to like the as necessary clause?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know, DQ, if you have a response today, but Jonah, I think that would be probably a good written comment if there's specific kind of factors that would drive or going to be a catalyst for that as necessary review. All right, JR, is that fair? There's not a response in the moment.
No, I think that's adequate, Jonah. I appreciate you flagging that, and where we can provide certainty if we can. I do. Yeah, we would like to consider that. And again, we would love to read any written comments or ideas you might have about that.
Good. Crystal?
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to comment on just the 5-year timeline. I'm really concerned about that, given that, every year that goes by, these are communities that are not being protected. And I'm also concerned about the or as necessary language. How would a community know if their exposures necessitated any kind of review, especially those communities with less power and privilege? And can we simply divest away accountability, withhold the funds from the agency, and the regulation disappears? I'm concerned that the political inconvenience of the review could outweigh efforts to protect people, and that the language or as necessary is insufficiently specific. So also interested in exactly what would trigger it and how anyone would know how to ensure accountability around that, especially if there's not enough funding to implement the program.
Thanks, Crystal. And I think similar to Jonah, I would say, right, this is the type of input that would be really helpful for the agency to get that level of specificity that may direct the agency to better define when as necessary would occur. Let's go, Jeff, and then Molly.
Thanks, Ben. I have 2 comments and a question. The 2 comments are on the update frequency proposal. Comment 1, in light of the proposal to adjust the frequency of reviewing TRVs to an every 5-year cadence, I believe and would beseech the agencies that now is the time to ensure then that the TRV set that will be proposed for promulgation by EQC is based on best available science, and to engage in the inquiry that we've been proposing be undertaken for the various chemistries of particular interest to folks that will need to do risk assessments in the next 5-year horizon. Second comment is, I would think that in a transition to a 5-year cadence, that the use of petitions to request that TRVs be made more stringent or more relaxed as science develops in the interim, to the extent the as necessary language doesn't get DEQ motivated to do rulemaking in the meantime, becomes particularly more important, so that the regulated community or the really others in the public at large could use the petition process to bring DEQ and OHA's attention to new science that might otherwise not yet have been on the radar that would be important to consider in the interim. So I want to make a plug for the petition process if the transition to a 5-year cadence is made. My question is about the other change that we discussed briefly about the possibility that DEQ could allow modifications to default soil exposure assumptions without requiring a level 4 risk assessment. This is kind of an implementation proposal, but it's one that I think I support in that a level 4 risk assessment by definition is a very expensive undertaking. The DEQ fees for level 4 risk assessment are pretty high. And I guess I would just wonder whether DEQ might also consider allowing modifications to default produce ingestion assumptions where appropriate in this same vein. And that's the question I have. I don't expect an answer now, but would appreciate that consideration. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll capture that, right? As are there other kind of defaults, particularly to your point around plant ingestion that could also be included. Molly, then Crystal.
Yeah, so my comment is actually on the previous slide around going from 3 to 5-year review rate. I absolutely hear and sympathize and am very empathetic to the community voice wanting to have the most up-to-date science possible and how confusing some of this stuff is. I am also an environmental epidemiologist that does this type of work and has research that is put into regulation. So I can speak to it actually from a scientific process that perhaps is a new voice to hear. That type of regulatory consensus that would lead to reference values takes at least, takes time. These are not numbers that change very frequently, even though many of us push on them. And since we're dependent on those authoritative sources, they're in the statute, OEA, ATSDR, EPA, and DEQ does not do its own risk assessment per se, unless there is something extraordinary. The move from 3 to 5 years is actually very reasonable in my opinion, because just the amount of time it takes to establish those reference values is kind of in a 5-year cycle from those regulatory agencies. So to me, moving from 3 to 5 is a reasonable change in process. So I actually really kind of support that simplification, even though it may be interpreted as not getting the most up-to-date science.
Yeah, thanks for that, Molly. Crystal?
I just wanted to say that the DEQ fees are clearly too low if the proposal is to go to a 5-year schedule due to a lack of capacity.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. Jeff, is that your old hand?
Sorry, I'll get my hand hygiene figured out.
Get that hand down. Molly, is that a new? Yep, all right. Yeah, I'll just perpetuate.
All right, same issue. There we go.
Yeah, hand up in perpetuity, right? Love to this place, right? If you go back to kind of the final roundtable discussion slide. I know we've heard, we've gotten into the weeds. There's been a lot of technical conversations. I did want to just broadly bring folks in. If we haven't heard from you, and I'll just make a long pause. If there's any takeaways, if there's any key points that you'd like to make, if there's further clarifications. I know we have a lot of folks in this room, probably some conversations that are not always easy to track and follow. But I did want to invite folks that we haven't heard from into the space, even if it's just a high level comment or reflection. We'll have to make sure that we get some of that. Yeah, John, thanks.
Yeah, I'll just talk on the practical implementation change of a 3 to 5 year cycle, which I think would be positive from the community's perspective. Is going back to what the JR said, is resources and time. Well, this is pausing that work. So you're increasing the frequency of pausing the work of actually doing risk assessments. So you'll be able to get more risk assessments done if you have a lower frequency, because you can't be doing this work and then doing risk assessments and having to go back and redo the risk assessments because you've changed the TRVs, for example. So that's just, I think, another efficiency that DEQ gets out of this change is it just makes it easier for you guys to process more risk assessments. So I just wanted to say, from an implementation perspective, that's my perspective. I think that's a really good change.
Thank you, John. Brothers that we haven't heard from, just invite you in. Yeah, Beth?
Hi. So I'm actually surprised at how little changes there are within the regulatory requirements. I was kind of expecting to see more information about how some of these rules could change. And one thing that is coming to my mind, we did talk a lot about diesel particulate matter, and we're seeing a large change in that TRV, which is going to have a large impact to a lot of different types of facilities. So thinking about how other states are handling this, I mean, we know that California has a fairly robust program that uses its own set of models, and Washington is doing more pollutant by pollutant review of individual components and constituents. But both of these regulating authorities are looking at filterable particulate matter coming from a diesel engine, whereas DEQ is looking at filterable plus condensable. So they're using Oregon Method 5 in order to determine how much diesel particulate matter is coming out. And I guess I'm trying to best understand why the standards are different between those three states, and yet the basis for the TRV is the same.
Is that a today answerable question, or is that a get back to you?
From our end, I think that's a great, really insightful question, Beth, and one that we can try to address and see if we can get there in the next meeting, have that discussion, or it might take us a little bit more time to provide a really robust response to that.
Appreciate that. And I think maybe along with that consideration, I know in California, they only look at diesel particulate matter as a way to determine what is the risk for the surrounding community.
Yeah. That for sure, we're definitely going to be talking about in our next meeting.
Okay, perfect. And then the last one on that same topic, I know we brought up the multitude of diesel generators you can have, right? We've got fire pumps, which are primarily there for safety. They have safety requirements, how frequently they have to be run, versus kind of the other end of the spectrum. You might be looking at a data center. But for all of these different types of facilities, there's certainly a frequency of operation. And all of the level 1 through 3 risk assessment is assuming a continuous exposure to all of these pollutants. And emergency generators, as a generality, right, they can have multiple, they can have one, but the frequency portion is still there. And you're not going to have somebody standing next to the fence line always breathing in that diesel fume that's coming from it. So I think consideration for the frequency of exposure at this point, it seems to be unaddressed. And I'm curious how we can best support maybe a more actuality or realistic. I think another, I guess, point to bring up on that is, I think it was John that mentioned earlier that, yes, diesel is something that we've really focused on, but only 10 tons was emitted last year versus the amount that's allowed to be permitted, which I don't know the value of that, but I know it's a lot more than 10 tons per year. And so I'd be curious of, what are we actually permitting these facilities for versus what's actually coming out of them? And how are we addressing that potentially stark difference?
Great discussion to have. And I would say, if you'd like to provide anything for the RAC members to consider ahead of our next meeting, anything that RAC members submit to us, we will share with the other RAC members. So I would invite you to do that, Beth, to help the conversation, because that we know what you're saying. The modeling is very complicated, but and like how are there changes we could make to that in the implementation that might get to a more realistic exposure assumption? I understand that, but it might be useful if you do have anything that you'd like to provide. That would be great.
All right. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Joe. Again, just inviting folks, if we haven't heard from you, love to kind of make sure we're giving that space and opportunity. Okay, I'm not going to call on anybody. So then just open it up, and then we'll take any other comments for this roundtable. And then for just really briefly, if you're a member of the public and interested in providing public input, you have a raise hand function. And if you raise your hand, we'll get you in a queue for the public input portion of the agenda. So we'll wrap up our roundtable, and then we'll formally open public input. But if you are interested, please raise your hand. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I just wanted to queue it up. So for our RAC members, just open it up then more broadly. If there's any final reflections or comments for today. Yeah, Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thanks for your facilitation of this conversation. And it's not lost on me. This is a point in time of a very complicated but critical program that was developed at a time when, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 10 years ago, I think a true crisis in the community, opened up and highlighted the faults of the air toxics program, Oregon's air toxics program, in regards to its blind spot for public health. And in the period of time when I started, which was almost another 10 years before that, piecing out what was regulatorily legal and what was safe was very, very difficult for the public. And that had created many points of conflict between industry and communities, who lived nearby. And it wasn't until the bigger crisis of 2016 that we finally had the opportunity to try and address that. And I just want to remind all of us that, we are trying to do difficult things, but we also are trying to rebalance the scale of a regulatory system that will be fundamentally protective of public health, because otherwise, why does it exist? Why should businesses pay any money in environmental controls unless there is an intentionality? But we never really had a way to measure. And so for years and years, communities would have to hear from DEQ that there was the concerns in community and the evidence for harm that was happening. If it was legal, DEQ would basically default to nothing, and in that default insinuate that it was fine. And I think we've finally gotten to a point of developing a tool for the agency, more importantly for the agency than for community to use. I think it is very complicated and it is very challenging. But the whole idea is to put the expertise and the tools into the hands of the regulators to do its job to protect public health. And I just want to say, Clean Air Oregon is not the regulatory stick, honestly, be really clear, regulatory stick that I think community had possibly hoped for in that moment to create, but it has, and it's shown it's been effective to create the regulatory tool that we need to address risk. And so I just want to appreciate the work and intentionality of the agency, both through the whole ATSAC process that it did, I think was incredibly strong and well executed, through this rulemaking to continue to move this program forward to address the risk to communities and to start to give communities a sense of relief that they do not have to be the vigilantes in this anymore, that there is a system in place that is scientifically based, evidence-based, that can act on its behalf. And I think that this agency has dramatically improved. I can't even compare, what this was 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago when I started this work to where we are today. And I just want to express my appreciation for the work and the integrity that's gone into this development. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Beth?
Thank you. Speaking about maybe another way we could consider speeding up this whole process. Right now, there's a requirement within the regulation to submit the AQ 520 form, to submit a modeling protocol and risk assessment work plan, to submit a risk assessment. So you have 3 separate reports that have to be submitted. Modeling protocol and risk assessment work plan is intended to identify how you're going to complete the risk assessment. And then the risk assessment restates that information and provides the results. I'd be interested in trying to speed that process to basically state you can do that and you can have the opportunity to have that discussion with DEQ, but it's not a requirement to submit separate reports. And I know currently that is how things like the modeling for NACs is written, to say that it is a possibility and maybe recommended. But if you have a facility that's, did the same thing last year and now they're installing a new piece of equipment, maybe a whole new protocol and plan as to how you're going to redo the thing that you've already done last year might not be as necessary. So I would consider updating the language there to specify that, it might be recommended or consultation with DEQ is important, but adding additional reports that have to be created and reviewed might not be necessary.
Thanks, Beth. And this, certainly named today, and I think we'll maybe come back in our next conversation as well around some of those additional pieces. Other last thoughts?
So I want to clarify that actually. So is there going to be more regulatory changes that we're talking about in the next meeting? Or was this kind of our final discussion point?
No, but the regulatory changes you're talking about, Beth, fit more into the implementation of the program. And so you proposing rule language changes in that venue is completely within the bounds of the discussion that we would expect to have. So it would, proposing specific changes to the rule language during that in writing or at that meeting, that would be what we'd like to hear too.
Sorry, I keep getting a little confused on what my when I'm supposed to be suggesting information, but I thought we were talking about the rule changes and implementation.
We're talking about the rule changes that we propose, the rule language. You're right to suggest it now. That's great, because we haven't proposed it. I think what Ben is saying and what we're saying is please bring this up again as well in that. And if you have specific language in that meeting, that you this is in, rule 50, like this spot here, like this is where we'd like to see that. But yeah, no, we don't want to limit or inhibit any feedback we're getting from you, just saying that it also would apply to that discussion as well. Track meeting number 4.
Oh, okay.
That makes sense, but sorry, I made that more confusing because today was like they're looking at actual proposed changes that had, I guess, blue lines, red line and blue line versus rules that we could also revisit to think about implementation more broadly.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
sorry, I was muddying those waters. Crystal?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to emphasize that communities have no way without this program to know or be protected from air quality risks. And this program's doing a good job having scientific findings to understand risk. We have permitting and also modeling to know how much pollution is being emitted and where it is going and the subsequent exposure and health effects. And especially given federal rollbacks and an ineffective EPA, this underfunded program is protecting public health in a critical way. and efforts to weaken it would be misplaced. So thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. Mary, I'm going to assume that's an old hand. Yeah, all right. No worries. Other thoughts? Again, I'll particularly ask if we haven't heard from you, although I think we've heard from almost everybody here today. If there's any other thoughts from the rulemaking group, otherwise I'm gonna.
Real
yeah,
quick, Ben,
Ben.
do you guys have a timeline on when you want comments submitted, written comments?
Yeah, we don't have that yet, John. It's a great question. We're kind of thinking about that on our end, just as far as timing. And we would present that at meeting number 4 as the sort of next steps of like when those deadlines.
But in meeting number 4 is June 30th, right? So there's a pretty significant amount of time. Well, I won't. It's June 30th. I'll just leave it at the statement. So certainly anything between now and then there'll be subsequent time after June 30th as well, John.
Thanks.
Yeah. I will still hold space for any other RAC conversations, but if we could pull up the public input slide. I do want to make sure that we're really clear that this is a space for members of the public who would like to offer input to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and subsequently to DEQ. This is an opportunity to provide those what we call informal comments. And what we mean is that they're incorporated, of course, into the consideration, but there's a formal public comment period that will occur later in this process. For those attendees, if you raise your hand, we can promote you to a panelist to come into the space and offer input for the group. So I'm going to do a call for those in the public audience who would like to offer input to raise your hand. There should be a raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. I'm not seeing any hands, so I'm going to do one last call for public input for today's meeting. Again, raise your hand if you're a member of the public that would like to provide input. Not seeing, oh, yes, we have one. So if we can promote, you're gonna have to teach me how to say your name. So if you could come off mute, introduce yourself, and I'd like you to limit your comments to 3 minutes. That would be wonderful.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to comment. I actually had a question. My comment is that this was a very helpful and informative session. So thank you all for the discussion. My comment was regarding the exposure time for acute impacts. I understand DEQ has a policy of a 24-hour exposure time to evaluate acute impacts. But oftentimes the maximal exposed individual receptor may not be exposed for 24 hours. And that makes the acute hazard index calculations overly conservative. For example, if the nearby exposed receptor is a worker receptor, you don't expect a worker to be working 24 hours. And so DQ needs to consider, I think, a way to, refine those acute estimates to be more realistic.
And then just before we go, do you mind introducing yourself for the record?
Sorry. So my name is Nikta Mehta, and I work with an environmental engineering company called Geoengineers.
Good, thank you. So what we'll ask is that you submit the question kind of in writing. I should have said that the public input is not a space for deliberation between the RAC or the agency and the public, but really an offer for input. So appreciate your comments. Get those in writing for a written response from the agency. But thank you for joining today. I'll ask if there's others that would like to offer public input today. Please raise your hand. And can we put the email in the everyone chat that members of the public could submit? We might have it on a slide. I don't. My old eyes can't see if it's on this slide or not, but if we could put it on the everyone chat for where folks could submit questions or input, that'd be great. I'll do one more call then for public input for this today's meeting. Not seeing any. I'm going to close the public input portion of our agenda. I'll do one last ask of our RAC members for any final comments before we move into next steps and close out for today. Okay, not seeing any. I'm going to pass it to my DEQ colleagues here and help us close out for the day and talk about what's coming up.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thank you all again for your participation in these past two meetings. We really appreciate the productive discussions. We've received some valuable information to consider on the proposed rules that we've covered in these meetings. Looking forward to our next and final meeting on June 30th, which will provide opportunities for you all to present information to DEQ to consider related to the implementation of these rules, as well as the fiscal and economic impacts of the proposed rules. This meeting will serve as the formal Fiscal Advisory Committee meeting. Ahead of this meeting, we will be providing materials for you all to review, a draft fiscal impact statement, as well as proposed implementation plans and slides. In regards to additional information that you would like the agencies to consider related to the technical aspects of the proposed rules that we've discussed over these past two meetings, please submit this information in writing to the email address specific for this rulemaking here on the screen. And as always, please feel free to reach out to myself or any other staff if you have any questions. And I think as we noted today in our discussions, please look for an email. We'll send out again, and we can solicit some times for office hours for follow-up on some of these discussion topics that folks have surfaced here today. And we look forward to that. Thank you again. And that's all from us.
Good. Ali, did you want to add anything? I saw you came on screen.
No, I just wanted to appreciate everyone's really engaged contribution here and the time that you've given us and your expertise. Really appreciate that. Look forward to our next meeting, and thank you again. Take care.
Appreciate that. Well, thank you. I'll extend the gratitude. Appreciate everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Much love and be well. Take care.
Thank you.